Right. We now have draft development contributions policy. We're actually a wee bit ahead of time, but the team is here. It's not very often we're ahead of time.
John.
Here we are. We're still in the morning. Good morning. Thank you for coming up a wee bit earlier, or down a wee bit earlier.
So this is a follow-up briefing to the briefing we gave you at the end of October on the draft development contribution policy. That briefing at the end of October covered the proposed policy changes, the changes to catchments, and the draft charges. We understand following that briefing there were some questions around those draft charges and how they had changed between the 2021 policy and the current policy. So this briefing is intended to give you some more information on how we have calculated those charges. So in terms of the briefing structure, we will walk through how development contribution charges are calculated. We'll then talk about the changes to inputs between the 2021 and 2024 policies. We'll then go over how our charges compare with other councils, and then go through our final draft charges for this policy. Provide you an update on next steps, and then we'll open the floor for questions. We've got the DC working group here to answer questions as well. So the LGA is very prescriptive in terms of how we have to calculate development contribution charges, and there are several steps we need to take. The first thing we need to do is to forecast growth. We do this using a residential and business growth model that identifies how much growth is forecast to occur, when it will occur, and where it will be located. We then have to identify what infrastructure is required to service that growth, where it is best located, and when it should be provided, seeking efficiency but also not impeding growth, so there can be a balancing act there. We then budget for infrastructure delivery in the LTP. All capital projects with some kind of growth component are identified for the DC policy. It is the LTP that dictates what projects will be included in the DC policy, not the other way around. The cost of providing growth infrastructure is outlined in the schedule of assets in the DC policy. This schedule details all assets required to service growth. We also need to take account of other cost drivers that should fund some of the costs of infrastructure as well. And then we allocate the cost of providing growth infrastructure to those that benefit based on what specific infrastructure is required to service a particular area and how much capacity different developments require. So these are the cost drivers for capital expenditure. We have renewals, which is the replacement of end-of-life assets, backlog, which is new or upgraded assets to meet a current level of service, and then increased levels of service. These are all funded through rates or some other non-DC source. We can only use DCs to fund the growth component of an asset. And just a reminder that capital projects can have multiple cost drivers. The growth component can be an entire asset or it can be the component of an asset. So a project that is primarily renewal or backlog may include the upsizing of the asset to cater for growth. We went over this in the October briefing, but just a reminder, a HUI is a household unit equivalent. This is how we measure demand in the DC policy. It is essentially the demand placed by one household unit, and the policy assumes that each lot or each section contains one HUI. We calculate the DC charge on a per project basis by dividing the cost to deliver the growth component of an asset by the number of new or additional households. The LGA requires that DC policies summarise the methodology behind how the per HUI charge is calculated and show how each charge is calculated. The DC charges must follow the methodology set out in the policy. They are not arbitrary numbers. So in terms of how the charges have changed between the 2021 and 24 policies, in 2021 the DC charges started at around $8,000 per HUI. This is a significant drop from past policies where DCs had started at around $21,000 to $22,000 per HUI. So the charges contained in our new draft policy are more in line with what the policies were like before 2021. So I'll talk through some of the components of that top line of the calculation, and then Amy will discuss the growth projections. So in terms of capital expenditure, the capital program increased significantly between 2021 and 2024. As a reminder, the overall capital program in 2021 was $5.78 billion and was $6.51 billion in 2024. And then we identify all projects in the capital program with a growth component. The schedule of assets within the DC policy lists the capital projects with the growth component. So the total cost in the schedule of assets was $2.6 billion in 2021 and went up to $3.5 billion in 2024. And then finally, we identify the growth component of those assets in the schedule of assets. The total cost of growth has also increased. It was $730 million in 2021 and is $916 million in 2024. We've got the asset planners here to speak about their individual projects and programs, and we've also got PMO to speak more broadly about the capital program if you would like. The DC policy also includes adjustments to the funding model to ensure that total revenue equals total costs after accounting for interest and inflation. The assumptions around the funding consequences included in the DC policy are consistent with what is in the LTP, and this is true for previous policies as well. So the images on your screen are the LTP projections for interest and inflation. LTP 21 is in orange and LTP 24 is in blue. Actual inflation between financial year 21-22 and 23-24 was significantly higher than what was allowed for in the LTP due to the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy. The higher levels of inflation for a longer period of time have contributed to an increased capital expenditure program. And then similar to inflation, the council's cost of borrowing has remained higher than allowed for in the 21 LTP due to the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on the global economy. And we have finance here to speak to this further if you would like.
Cool. Onto the growth side. So this slide here is really just a bit of a reminder about what we talked about earlier in the year when we came and presented to you on the growth models. So we don't project growth, we rely on Stats NZ to do that for us. So we use their household and population growth projections. Christchurch traditionally tracks very close to the medium growth projections, and it remains a good indication of future growth in the city. Our business growth projections are provided by an external economist and are also updated regularly and have been performing very well. We monitor closely actual growth versus projected growth as well, so we are keeping an eye on what is happening in terms of what we've projected and what we've seen. In terms of the next stage, we use our growth models to take Stats NZ projections and model where the growth is likely to happen. The council has a suite of models which are listed up there that looks at the distribution of both household and business growth. There's a range of inputs that go into both of these models, and that includes projections from Stats NZ or our business projections, building consent information, zoning, feasibility information, and greenfield or ODP staging. It's important to remember, though, that they are models which are inherently underpinned by a number of assumptions, and our focus is on getting them as accurate as we can. And to help with that, our team is doing a lot of ongoing monitoring that I just talked about to understand what those growth trends look like. So we're going to take a bit of a look back to understand what has happened and why growth may have changed over the last few years. So as you can see in that graph up on the screen, the city has seen some big ups and downs in the past 15 years, and it's probably fair to say that no other city in New Zealand has seen such rapid population change as you can see in the middle of that graph. In the 10 years pre-quake, the city was growing by around 4,250 people per year on average. There was some variance year on year, but generally it was relatively consistent. In the 2010 and 11 earthquakes happened, which caused a sudden and rapid decrease in population, driven by a significant downward swing in net migration. And we saw that in terms of people leaving the city, going out to some of the other TAs, or moving to around the city, or moving elsewhere in the country. Between June 2010 and June 2012, the city's population decreased by 21,200 usual residents, so not insignificant. By June 2017, and you can see it in that graph there, the city had recovered to our pre-earthquake population levels, which equates to growing by around 5,000 usual residents each year, so 20-ish% higher than what we were growing at pre-quake. Stats NZ have recently done a report that evaluates the accuracy of estimates and projections between 1996 and 2018 and found that rapid population change is a factor in relative errors, largely relative errors, and as you've just seen in that last graph, we have seen significant rapid population change. The projections that informed the 2021 policy were made at a point where the city had just experienced a sudden unexpected shock, but 2013 base information was still the best that we had at the time. At the time the 2021 policy was prepared, Stats NZ had not yet released 2018 census-based household projections. We didn't get those until December 2021. So we were operating off the best information we had at the time, which was still based on those post-earthquake population changes. It's important to remember as well that projections are made at a point in time and are based on the best information available at that time and are updated regularly, so it's very normal for them to change. The December 2018 census-based projections reflect a more normal growth pattern for Christchurch, which isn't dissimilar to what we were seeing pre-earthquake. So this graph here shows you the difference between the projections used in the 2021 BC policy and the projections being used in the 2024 policy. And as you can see up there, in the first 10 years, the projections are actually relatively similar. The projections used for the 2024 policy are actually ever so slightly higher than those used in 2021. The biggest difference in that first 10 years is around 3% between the two sets. The biggest change is in the long-term projections, so the last 20 years that you can see up there, where growth is expected to be slower than previously projected. So it's not that growth that was projected won't happen, it's that it's going to happen at a slower rate. The difference in the long-term projections ranges from 2%, which you can see in those sort of that earlier part of the 20 years, to 11%, which you can see at the end of the entire 30-year period up there. Overall, the 24 projections are much flatter and reflect that we have returned to a slower rate of growth than what we were seeing in the city post-quake. And again, it's a good reminder that projections do change, and it's important that we keep on top of the latest projections and understand why they're changing, so understanding those drivers, but we can't expect that they'll stay the same. And if you look at that graph up there, it's likely that Stats NZ will revise the projections that we've used in this policy another 5 or 6 times over the next 30 years. So they're revising them regularly, we're picking them up regularly, and we have ongoing dialogue with Stats NZ about our population change and growth and what it means. Oh, there's one more. There's one more.
Shall we clean up a few questions at the moment, or do you want to keep going?
I'm going to keep going. Sorry, there's one more that I've missed.
Okay. All right.
So wrapping that up, overall the 24 policy is based on a slower rate of growth, particularly in the long term, which you just saw. Growth projections are subject to change and are affected by a range of factors, including sudden, rapid population change, changing migration patterns and trends, which we certainly saw post-COVID-19, and changing demographic profiles as well. So things like our population ages, our household size comes down, which has an impact on the overall number of households in the city. Projected growth does change, and we should expect that it will continue to change, and both the earthquakes and COVID-19 were good examples of how quickly and unexpectedly things can change. As growth has slowed, the cost of growth, which we know is going up, is being spread over fewer households. You've seen that the DC charges have gone up. So growth is one factor, but there's also the others that Alan has just talked about.
So we thought it could be useful to show you a real project that is in the DC policy, just to show you how some of those factors that we've just talked about have impacted the DC charge. So this project on your screen is the Bexley Dog Park, which is classed as a sports park. Oh,
We'll just do the questions that before we get into specific charges. So I have Mark, Sarah, and Andre. Anya.
Thank you. Just thinking back to one of your earlier slides, where you're talking about growth and funding of DC projects, is there any way to use DCs to catch up on projects that should have been done through DCs, but for whatever reason weren't?
so the cost allocation should be identified when the projects go into the DC policy. Capital programs are reviewed with each DC policy, but you can't just take a project that was identified as backlog, for example, and then make it growth and then add it to the policy. But if projects that were actually growth were missed, they could be added to the policy. But yeah, the cost allocation shouldn't change from policy to policy in terms of the actual cost drivers. The growth component should be identified upfront, which is why we need to get them into the policy early so we can start collecting DCs for them.
Right. So I'd be hearing from that then there's no way where there's a project that should have happened as growth can be clawed back. It has to go back into the general backlog rates pool.
I think it would probably depend on the specific kind of project, and then you'd have to speak to the individual asset planners. But the cost drivers are usually identified because they are the reason that the project is being delivered in the first place. So you're looking at why are we delivering it and who is benefiting from it, and so those projections are usually done early.
Yeah, right. So particular example is a transport project that should have happened.
We have the transport plans here to.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Sarah.
Thanks. Just two quick ones. Firstly, in your conversations with the Stats Department, do they take into account climate migration, especially on those outer years, or are they waiting for more policy development and things around that? Because we know that there's going to be climate migration.
So migration is one of the things that they do take into account, and at the moment it's really looking back to model forward as well. So I would expect as things progress you would start to see that picked up in those projections, but it may not be explicitly identified. It will just be that shifting.
It would just be probably useful in which is when you're having your conversations, if that's one of the things that you start talking to them about and saying, hey, listen, we recognise we've got space for growth, and that there's going to be climate migration. Are you taking this into account and those kind of things?
Could do that.
That'll be good. And the other one is on the relationship between the cost of growth when it comes to infrastructure and then eventually OPEX and stuff over time maintenance, the rating base that's then enabled by growth, and how that relates to density versus greenfields developments. And so when we have population growth, we don't necessarily sprawl, but we can get rating base increases without bigger, can we at some stage get a briefing or some information as one of these on how that has worked in Christchurch as a whole? That would be probably quite useful. Yeah, because where the growth is impacts the costs and rating base. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
Andre?
My question relates to the slides coming up. Are you happy to come back to me?
the ones coming up, you're ahead of the game. Right. Okay, Yanni, have you got one for now?
Yeah, I mean, it's half for now, half for later. But just in terms of the bigger picture, is it possible to look at a local neighbourhood level around where the growth has occurred? So areas like in the LTP, we get communities coming in saying we've had lots of intensification, but we don't see any projects to address the impact of that. Are we able to look and see, say, Linwood, for example, what's happened in terms of growth, and then look at what projects we're putting in place?
So part of what our team is doing is once building consent is approved, we take it and we add some additional information to it, which includes has there been a demolition, and how many new houses have been added. So we're tracking net new housing, and we have that down to a record so we can report on that at any level. On our website, and it's publicly available, and we can send the link around, is a report that we update monthly around where that growth is happening and how much growth. So I'll get that circulated.
I get it in terms of housing, and I've had a look, and it's quite good at the public-facing website. But I guess I'm trying to understand in terms of the bigger trends, if we can kind of see the hot spots, and also, do we track population with the census as well?
So census gives us population, and we get estimates at a citywide level every year, but we don't get that good subsidy information other than census every 5 years.
Right.
So that's why we use the building consents to track where's growth happening and what's happening. So we have a lot of information sitting there underneath that, and we can cut and dice it.
Yeah.
However,
And do we have any sense of, and I know it's kind of early days, but do we have any sense of the Airbnbs, the distribution of short-term visitor accommodation?
nope. But we may get some sense from the stats in the census data. Sorry, when we get the mesh block data and we can look at unoccupied homes.
Right. But sorry, just for my clarity around Airbnb, we were setting up a register.
Yes, the register's in place and people hit and miss registering.
So can we get any data from there around where the growth of Airbnbs has been?
We can take some data, how reliable it is, because it's reliant on people putting themselves on the register.
Yeah.
So we don't think it'll be complete information, but we could do that.
Right.
There's people living in an Airbnb.
Thanks.
Using for Airbnb.
Okay, but having said that, also, if a person has built a new house or a number of new houses, buildings, they paid the DCs on it, whether there's a Airbnb or not, it's still already paid for the use of the sewer and stuff,
Yeah.
isn't it? So it's already done it.
Yeah, but the thing with the Airbnbs, they've paid the DCs, etc., but it's not a resident, because that then a resident has to go and build somewhere else, because that's not an Airbnb, or there has to be another property for them to live in, a resident. Mm-hmm. So it's also about controlling our growth as a city.
Different issue, and it's your question.
Do we have an idea, because with the graph with regards to population, we've got the big dip with regards, this one. So do we have an understanding of why over COVID we lost 1,100 people? Because COVID hit everywhere, so you've got a population that's moved somewhere else with COVID, so it's kind of a bit odd.
Yep. So if you think about migration patterns over those 2 years, a lot of people would have probably, when borders were closed, left and gone home. And then we had almost no growth for about 2 years. So it's that sudden shock that I'm talking about in terms of COVID isn't a unique one, because it probably had an impact in terms of a lot of people leaving. Earthquake's the same. But then we didn't get that same recovery until the last couple of years when those borders opened again.
No,
No, that's people.
Yeah, but like Auckland, for instance, in COVID would have had a whole lot of people leaving Auckland to go home, but we didn't get the influx.
So the other thing that's important to remember with Stats NZ and migration is it actually takes a couple of years to track where someone has migrated to. So they arrive in the country and they arrive in at a certain place, but where they settle, we don't know for. It's around 2 years down the track that they revise that data and we get the updates. So that's what I'm saying. Things change and Stats NZ get more information and we get more information, and it changes, and sometimes it changes a lot, sometimes it changes a little bit, but it's not flat by any means.
Okay. Could you go to the next slide? I think the one with the 2 line. No, that one.
Yep.
So when we were when it was green and we thought we're on fire and we're into it, we designed a lot of growth projects. Is that, and they're already in the pipeline? And just because there's less people here, they're having to pay more for those? Is that?
So I think that's where that first 10 years is really important. So capital program is 10 years. So the first 10 years of that graph, they're relatively similar. They're
Yes.
similar enough that it's, because we recovered DCs over 30 years, that long-term trend is having an impact on those DC charges. So the cost has gone up in terms of catering for growth. First 10 years, your growth is relatively similar. Last 10 years, that's where we've seen the most change, and that growth rate has flattened out and slowed down. So it is probably having less of an impact in that final 10 years than you think, because that LTP is 10 years, whereas those final 20 are DCs recovered over 30 years.
So sorry, what I'm saying is, say 2058, in theory, is it going to be a lot less people here?
At the moment, so that's what I'm saying. In that last 20 years, Stats NZ are going to revise those projections another 4 or 5 times. So as trends change and things like climate migration starts to happen, that line will shift, and where it will go, at the moment, that's the best indication that we have. But Stats NZ are revising those regularly. So I think the first 10 years is probably the most important bit at the moment, because that is relatively near future.
I'll phrase it another way. Because it says cost of growth has been spread across fewer houses, so that's why the price goes up. So why, if there's fewer I know they don't run just side by side. If there's fewer houses, why are we still planning for so much growth? If it's the houses that have got to pay for it.
At the moment, your growth that you're planning for is that first 10 years. But DCs are recovered over 30 years to share that cost of the infrastructure with the people who use it.
Even if we haven't built it at this stage.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Okay, I've actually got a question for Gavin. That pumping station that we're doing and we're going to, I'll say Summerfield, I'm not sure, and it pumps it across to St. Street. Is that is a growth thing? Because if people hadn't moved into Christchurch, we wouldn't have had to build that. Is that all funded by DCs and everyone around the whole town chips a wee bit into it?
No, the primary driver for that project is sewage overflows, so its level of service will probably backlog. But there is a portion of it is for growth, because obviously it's catering for future growth at that part of the city. But the primary driver is level of service to remove overflows to Heathcote.
So it's not a DC thing?
There should be a portion of funding from DCs for it, because it does also cater for additional growth.
Now, okay, thank you. Just another question for the people out there on TV. In town, just for argument's sake, for an example, if there's one house on a section and it gets bowled over and 3 get built, they only pay DCs on 2 because there's 2 extras. Yes. So I know that, but I'm just letting people out there know that. Okay. And have we given any thought to making whatever the DC number is, every new build, the number's averaged out, so it's the same all over the city?
As in like a flat DC charge?
Yeah, so say it's $1 million and there's 1 million houses, it's $1 each. That's simplistic.
So the LGA has principles of fairness and equity, and making sure that people who benefit from the infrastructure pay for the infrastructure. And that's why we use catchments to sort of ring-fenced benefit to certain parts of the city. So the LGA discourages the use of a district-wide catchment unless you have good rationale to do it. So there are some projects, there are some activities that we consider the entire district benefit from, regardless of where the project is located and where the property is located. So community infrastructure, for example, sports parks, regional parks, they're all district-wide. But in terms of things like wastewater, water supply, transport and neighbourhood parks, things like that, we consider that they are best ring-fenced to certain catchments. on the basis that certain developments benefit more, or some certain developments benefit from that infrastructure and other developments don't. So the LGA discourages the use of district-wide catchments, so we do not have them in our policy.
But say, take the likes of a development, the developer buys the land, builds everything and gives it to the council, so it's already paid for it, but it pays for the right to hook on to I'm just helping people out there, it's paying for the right to hook onto the water or the sewer or the stormwater system, more or less, and a bit for transport and a bit for parks. That's where you come up with that number.
And paying for the benefit of the capacity that is in that network for those assets.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Tyrone.
Just on, I've got that chart there. So the projections, so you're working in with Stats NZ, right? But ultimately we decide what our projections are, right? Like, I mean, we take, and, you know, that's probably, in my view, quite low, the red line. But is there, how does the value of DCs work with, like, if we lower the projection, what does that do to the calculation? And if we raise it, what does that do to the calculation?
If it goes down,
If we put it down, the
costs will go up because
costs will go up, and vice versa. So it's actually probably in our interests, forgetting about the developers for a second, just in terms of revenue, to lowball continuously, right? Maybe you don't need to answer that, but if you lowballed it, it would push the costs up. That's probably
assuming that it went down. You also need to think about how much infrastructure you'd have to provide, but you would also need to think about how much infrastructure you would need to provide in the long term. And that's what I'm saying, in those first 10 years where you've already planned, that's where the projections are really important.
Right.
And just to that point, the DC charges are based on the best information that we have. We can't manipulate the charges to get higher or lower DCs based on, to manipulate growth to get higher or lower DCs. They kind of just are what they are based on best information.
Yep. What are the underpinning assumptions behind that number, actually? Is that something that we can...
A lot. We can dig them out for you. There's a whole...
Be interesting to know.
...document on it.
Yeah, because... and just one final thing. So just looking at the additional information you provided, like in the scheme of development contributions, we seem relative... We're not the lowest, but we're not the highest. We're sort of...
With respect to other councils, we'll get to that.
Not compared to
that
Wellington.
in a second.
Okay, cool.
I have
All
some,
carry on.
some comparisons.
Carry on, please.
So we just thought we would provide you with a bit of an example of how these inputs have impacted an actual project that's in the policy. So this is the Bexley Dog Park. We've chosen this even though it's a fairly small project with quite a low DC charge. It isn't impacted by the changes that we've made to catchments, because it's a district-wide activity. So this also hasn't been impacted by changes to capital costs. So this is just impacted by changes to growth projections and changes to the cost to service debt. So with this project, when in 2021 it was projected that there would be an additional 63,000 households over the funding period of this project. And in 2024, that's gone down to 39,000 households. And then in terms of interest, the cost to service the debt associated with this project has essentially doubled. And so the impact of that is that the cost of this charge has gone from 32 cents to 57 cents. Again, that's a fairly low DC charge in the context of other projects. But this trend is seen across the entire DC policy. And then you've got projects where the costs have gone up between the 2021 and 2024 policy. And you've also got projects that have been added to the policy in 2024, just to give you an idea of why some of these charges have gone up so much.
So just for everyone out there, when the 39,000 people come in and the last 57 cents is paid, right, and that dog park is paid off, the next person that moves into that area that doesn't exist is missing, and it's done. You can't claim for something that's already paid for, is that right?
Yeah, so the model that we use to calculate DCs will pull these projects out of the policy once they are considered fully funded. We can't over collect on projects.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
No, yeah. Okay, sorry, carry on, then I'll do questions.
So in terms of how we compare with other councils, the data on your screen is the averages for the other metro councils. So one thing I'll just note though is these aren't apples to apples comparisons. Councils are making different decisions around how they provide for growth, and councils have different growth projections within their district. So Auckland has quite a range of DC charges because they have quite a large number of catchments. And we've got two lines on your screen because they are currently consulting on a new draft policy. So under the current policy, their DC start at 11,000 and go up to 105,000 per Huey. And then under the new policy, they start at 21,000 and go up to 136,000 per Huey. The charges on the higher end are for investment priority areas, which is areas where Auckland know they're going to have a lot of growth in the future, further than the 10-year life of their LTP. So they're starting to collect for projects that will be delivered up to 30 years in the future. So they've got one overlay in their current policy for Drury, and I think they've added 4 additional IPAs to their new policy. Hamilton, their DCs start at 27,000 per Huey and go up to 73,000 per Huey. Tauranga start at 38,000 and go up to 80,000. Tauranga and Hamilton both have small and large residential unit adjustments, so these are the charges for a 3-bedroom home. Wellington DCs are fairly low. They started around 10,000 and go up to 35,000. And Dunedin's are quite low as well. They start at 2 and go up to 17.
Yep.
Wellington and Dunedin don't, on the lower end, don't charge for every single activity. So that's why some of those DCs are a little bit lower.
Karen, please. Yep.
And then in terms of the Greater Christchurch councils, these are the averages for the townships. We thought this might be more useful than the range. Given the wide range of catchment types that they have in their district. So Waimak, their DCs start at 37 and go up to 72,000. Selwyn District Council, their DC policy is a little bit unusual in that there are a lot of things that go into the DC charges, including the size of the underlying section. Selwyn also has a large number of development area overlays in their policy for the council to recover infrastructure required to service specific growth developments. So in terms of these numbers on the screen, this is excluding any development area overlays. So their DC start at 37 and go up to 44,000 per Huey. So we're really not out of step with other councils. And then I'll just move through these fairly quickly. These were provided to you in draft form in October. So the charges for the central catchment will be 29,000 per Huey. In the east catchment, they are 29,000 per Huey as well. In the south catchment, they are 32,000 per Huey. In the west catchment, they are 37,000 per Huey. And in the north catchment, they are 37,000 per Huey. Banks Peninsula are 24,000 per Huey, and then Akaroa is 44,000 per Huey, and that is a separate catchment because of the wastewater treatment plant out there. So in terms of next steps...
Just to be clear, it's only new houses that will pay in Akaroa.
Yes. Each lot is assumed to contain 1 Huey
Correct.
credit.
That's
so
right.
if you build a house,
just for people.
Thank you for
don't
clarifying
pay
that,
DCs,
Your
but if you
Worship.
subdivided, you would.
Yep. So very roughly, just looking at it, it's around about $5,000 roughly, just looking at difference between what we had and what we've got.
So the 2021 policy DC started around 8 and go up to, well, Akaroa goes up to 68, but in the metro area, they start at 8 and go up to around 32, 34. But previous policies, they started at around 21, 22. So comparing the current policy to the 2016 policy, we're sort of roughly about where we were 10 years ago plus.
No, that's right.
interest
No,
and
no, yeah,
inflation.
I'm just actually get confused with the GST, but carry on.
And then just very quickly, the key dates have changed slightly just so we could allow time to do this briefing. So we will bring a draft policy to Finance and Performance for approval to go out for consultation. That will go to the Finance and Performance meeting on the 18th of December. Subject to your approval, we will commence consultation in the new year. So consultation will run mid-January through to mid-February. We'll have a hearings panel likely in late March, depending on availability of councillors and committee staff, and then we expect we will present the final report to council for adoption at the end of May.
Okay, Yanni, and then Andre.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for the really awesome presentation. Really like the way that you've highlighted like an individual case. I was just wondering, so take things like Hallsville Junction Road, for example, which not only does the project cost more, but the total project budget has increased significantly. How has that impacted in terms of DCs?
In terms of the specific project, I don't know off the top of my head.
But even say the Bexley Dog Park, like the interest cost has risen, but if the project cost increased from like 85 to 100, what's the mechanism to get the additional costs?
It would be updated in the schedule of assets.
So developments are assessed for the consent that the consent is assessed for the policy that's in place at the time a complete application is received. So developments that put their consent in now will pay under the 2021 policy. Projects that get their consent in, say in October next year, will pay under the new policy and they'll pay the new charges.
Right. So is there any way there's no way to change what people pay, right? It's based on the information at the time, but is there, we do this annually, we set the DC program.
We are currently reviewing the policy every 3 years. We are considering annual updates to update the capital projects, just so we are collecting for everything that is current.
Oh, cool. So if we had, because I'm just mindful that at the moment in this environment, we're getting every 3 months, we're even getting significant updates in terms of cost, Hallsville Junction Road. So, is there a mechanism that we can just automate and push a button and we just immediately get, when we know a project cost has increased significantly, we can capture the DCs?
We have to consult on changes to the DC charges, so we can't just randomly, or we could, but it wouldn't probably be very efficient, randomly update the DC policy without proper consultation. So having it on some kind of review cycle is the most effective way to capture changes to capital projects.
Right. So, for example, Te Kaha, which is I think our single biggest cost project, people are still paying under the...
Te Kaha is not in the DC policy. It's considered a replacement of Lancaster Park.
It's not
So
growth.
we're not collecting DCs
It's
for
not growth, is it?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
The car has not growth, so it's just
Right. But okay. And the only other question I had really was, it's around the catchments. It's kind of two questions within the catchments. One is, I'm interested in how you come up with the geographic areas, because when I look at the typology, actually, there's some areas that have got sort of brownfield intensification within the same catchment, like in the east, for example, and then you've got other areas which are more greenfield growth. So I'm kind of interested in that, and I'm also interested in, you've given us a comparison of Selwyn and Waimak. If we can have a regional catchment, because 80,000 people living in Selwyn, almost a fifth of our population now, and we can't collect anything from them. Can we, or could we?
I can give you a rundown on the catchments and how we get there. So it's a fine balancing act of looking at typology in terms of housing, where growth is happening. So if you think about PC14, some of those walkable catchments around centres as well, and where business growth is happening, and trying to keep areas within a single catchment. So we have been through a few revisions just to try and get those right, but we're looking at areas that are generally quite similar, where that household growth is happening, where future household growth is happening, the typology of that, and then building business in around that as well. So the catchments have to work for both residential and business, which is the challenging bit.
Okay, thank you, Yannick.
And sorry, the regional catchment.
That one I can't answer.
I don't think that would be possible outside of our district.
But effectively ECAN could set up.
I don't think
or
they
credit
can't
crushes.
do development contributions.
Yeah, territorial authorities and unitary councils can charge DCs, but not regional councils. So ECAN don't charge development contributions.
Right. So there's no way to have a DC contribution from growth in Selwyn to offset the cost.
No.
I mean, I think that's worth a letter to the
We
minister,
can only
like
charge
the Kiwi Rail.
for development in our district.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now we're nearly there. What's your name? Andre.
Thank you. Is able to bring up the West charges slide. So currently, new builds in halls will pay a specific Halsall catchment, and it's $15,000 plus GST towards stormwater and flood protection. This shows the amount of 5,800, which is quite a big drop.
Oh, the catchments for stormwater have changed, and they are in the catchment maps that I think you have. Where we had smaller catchments for stormwater before, we now have one for the urban catchment and one for Banks Peninsula.
Okay. I mean, the cost of stormwater and flood protection certainly hasn't decreased. It would have increased by a lot since then. So I'm just wondering how the amount charged for new builds in Halsall would become 2/3 cheaper than it is.
Because it's the catchments are bigger, so there's just more households that
people.
are paying for the
Yep.
cost of that asset because we've moved to bigger catchments for water. The projects
Okay.
are still in the DC policy.
Okay, so in short, it will mean places in being built around Hornby Yoldhurst will be paying towards, for example, the Te Kuru wetlands. In short. And okay, thank you.
So just one question I wouldn't mind seeing. Take likes of what you've got there with what Andreas said. I wouldn't mind seeing what it was or what it is. Another whole line for the 32,000. What it was and what projects have gone in there that will take it up to 30. I don't know what it was, but what's made it get to 32, so people can understand that it was this, but all of these other things are going in there, like we'll say Eastman Basin or I don't know, and this is what's caused it to get up to this high number.
So the policy includes a schedule of assets that has every single project that is in the DC policy, and in that schedule it identifies which catchments are seen as benefiting from this infrastructure. So the schedule of assets outlines every project that has gone into that DC charge.
Okay, thank you. Vic?
Thank you. I'm looking at the map on the development contribution charges for Central, and within there we've got a big development coming up out in Grasmere Estates in the East Papanui development. There's a significant amount of funding from the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund of 30 million. Can you confirm that you've calculated that in and around into this?
Those projects are not in the DC policy. They've been removed. The overlay's been taken out.
But just clarify, the projects are still in
The Grasmere projects are not in the policy anymore.
at all.
I might clarify that a bit.
Yeah, you might need to clarify that a little bit more. So the overlay is no longer in there.
The overlay is no longer in there because that development, the infrastructure only services the Grasmere development. You can't recover the cost from other developers, so it's been removed from the policy, if that makes sense.
So what's the DCs likely to be there then? Because I've heard a rumour they might be quite high. Are they likely to be similar?
They'll be the central.
Oh, okay. So they'll just be 29-ish.
Yes.
Okay, sweet.
Cool. Is that all the questions then?
Right, that brings us to the end of our briefings this morning. Thank you. Yeah. So we will reconvene at 1:30, isn't it?
1:30 for
1:30 for PC 14. See you then.